So I have the pleasure of working with Nicole Hollywood-Walker, and we have a great event planned for you guys tonight. I'm excited to introduce you guys to Adam and Brandon and have a great discussion about his amazing book, The Author versus Editor Dilemma. If you have not had a chance to read it, definitely want to get your hands on it. So we have, again, a very engaging discussion plan tonight. But before we dive into the discussion, I want to give a special thank you to Adam and Brandon for being here tonight. And, or I should say, Dr. Adam Mathis is our wonderful moderator who will guide the conversation. He is a double eagle, and he chairs the homeless committee for the Buckhead Coalition, starts on the Emory Alumni Board, and he's a member of the Downtown Atlanta Rotary Club. That's just a few of the many contributions that he has as a active community leader, and we are excited. I'm going to hand it over to you, Adam.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Hey, a beautiful event. Thank you for all the work that's
Press the button on there. Make sure the button's green.
There we go.
Great. Perfect.
So what I said was a beautiful event. Thank you for all the work that went into planning this. It's exciting. And it's my privilege to introduce Brandon Smith. I'm going to read from you the bio in the back of the book because I want to include everything while also honoring the work and breadth of the scope of your work. Brandon Smith is a leading expert in leadership communication and curer of workplace dysfunction, known as the workplace therapist. Host of the Workplace Therapist podcast and co-host of the Leadership Foundry podcast, Brandon is a sought-after executive coach, TEDx speaker, and award-winning instructor. He is the founder of the Worksmiths LLC, an executive coaching and leadership development firm whose clients include numerous Fortune 500 companies. Brandon has personally coached more than 1,000 leaders and executives across the globe, representing both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. Closer to home, Brandon is also a 2005 MBA graduate from Goizueta and Emory alum, and also serves as an adjunct faculty at Goizueta, among other prestigious business schools, in the course of which he has won over a dozen teaching awards for his work in the classroom. He's been featured and interviewed on NPR, Fox News, The Wall Street Journal, NBC, New York Post, Fast Company, CNN, and many other media outlets for his expertise in leadership and workplace dynamics. In addition, his graduate work includes an MS in counseling from Georgia State University, a topic we hope to get into a little bit, as well as the MBA from Emory University. And perhaps most important, he resides in Atlanta with his wife, Emily, and their 3 children and 2 lovable pups. So please join me in welcoming Brandon Smith to the conversation.
And thank you all for being here tonight.
So I just wanted to start. I've really enjoyed the book. I lead a company right now and I've had to apply some of the principles I've learned immediately. Can you help me understand maybe what the insight was, what precipitated authoring this book on this subject?
Yeah, so we'll have to go back in time, Adam, about 6 years, 6 or 7 years. And so I've been an executive coach for almost 20 years, and I was running into the same challenge with all the leaders I was coaching. Didn't matter if they were managers, directors, vice presidents, ran nonprofits. It seemed like all of them were running into this challenge where they felt such a responsibility or obligation to really care for their organization and deliver results that they were in many ways overstepping, and they were doing the work of their teams, and they were doing it for good reasons. There was a spirit of humility or servant leadership, this idea that I'll roll up the sleeves and kind of help out. And while that was good, the net result was they were doing way too much work. So not only were they working 60, 65 hours or more, their teams weren't really developing and growing. And so it was that problem, that challenge that I was seeing consistently over and over again that sparked the impetus for the author-editor concept. So I happen to be wrapping up another book, not this book, but a previous book. And I think I must have been thinking author-editor because I was working on that in the background. And so I use that analogy, and it just unlocked a lot of the challenges for that client. And so the next client call, I used it again, used it again, and now we have a book.
So it's interesting, you saw a trend where leaders in the workplace found themselves needing to author or to unpack that a little bit, to do the work for their subordinates. Were they happy with the results of the work they were doing for their teams?
No one was happy.
Nobody was happy.
No one was happy. So what really started that dynamic, so I'll go back to the book I published in 2020. That's the hot sauce principle, how to live and lead in a world where everything is urgent all the time. So that was the initial background into this. I think whether we're in the nonprofit world or for-profit world, there's a sense of urgency. Our phones and technology are part of that. But there's just a sense of urgency, like everything's got to be done tomorrow. And so that was a pressure point for these leaders. In addition, the organization was telling them, you're responsible for these results. And so what they said in their mind was, well, I can teach or coach this person to do it, but it's going to take a lot longer. I'll just do it myself. And that works once or twice. But if that's your entire mode of operating, well, then you never develop your team and everything becomes on your shoulders. And that was what was happening. So I was experiencing leaders that were very burned out and not having the support of their team and feeling frustrated. So that's what really sparked it.
I can imagine that is a familiar feeling from a lot of people in the workplace. Help me understand the whole paradigm of author and editor.
So I'm going to start by sharing the concept. The concept is incredibly simple. Incredibly simple. Execution is very difficult. So we'll talk about the concept first. So essentially, whenever there's a leader and a direct report, in that dynamic, someone has to sit in the author seat and someone has to sit in the editor seat. So both seats have to be filled. The key is knowing what seat to sit in when. So when I'm coaching my leaders to cut to the chase, I'm encouraging them to sit in the editor seat with their teams 80% of the time and the author seat only 20% of the time. And that makes perfect sense if you think about your all-time best direct reports. You think about your all-time best direct reports, they come to you and they say, Adam, there's a problem or issue. Here's what I think we should do about it. I'd love to get your thoughts. They author a solution for you to edit. We love those folks. They make our life so much easier. And what do our maybe not quite so effective direct reports do? They say, hey, Adam, there's a problem or issue. What do you want me to do about it? And as soon as they put their hands up in the air, it seems very innocent, but what they're really doing is they're reeling you into that author seat. And so now you're either telling them what to do, which takes a lot more time, or you just say to them, hey, everything's urgent all the time. Why don't I just do it for you? And you jump in. And when we sit in the author seat, remember, those seats have to be filled. So when we sit in the author seat, by definition, that individual who's the direct report is sitting in the editor seat. They're saying, don't look at me. I didn't do it. Adam did it. Or don't look at me. I'm just doing what Adam told me to do. Or what Brandon told me to do.
Deflect responsibility.
Deflect responsibility. That's right. So it's really all about making sure we're intentional about what seat we're sitting in with. And there is a time and place to offer. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying we edit 100% of the time. But with direct reports, the target, the goal is 80% editor, 20% author. And in a perfect world, the way it should work is in the entire system, we author up and we edit down. We author up and we edit down. So I even teach CEOs and directors of nonprofits how to do this with their boards. Because if they don't come in with a clearly authored point of view with their boards, those boards have strong opinions made up of very smart folks. They will jerk the steering wheel to the left and to the right. You don't have a clear point of view.
You know, reading the book and experiencing that insight for myself, some fond Emory memories came back to me. Specifically, when I was working on a graduate degree and I was responsible for producing a dissertation, I would go to my advisor and want to talk things through. And using this paradigm, I realized I was asking for him to give me some authorship. I would even talk to another graduate student, say, you know, this and that, I'm working on this and that. He looked at me and just said, look, if you want the advisor to tell you what to write, you need to choose a different advisor. You have to actually produce something, and it has to be open to critique. And I didn't want to look like an idiot, but also I had some trepidation putting pen to paper and producing something of my own thinking that wasn't overly reliant on its own words. So the paradigm made sense to me quickly because of that shared Emory experience. I'm sure a lot of us have. Have you encountered a time where the paradigm of author and editor didn't come so naturally to someone in the workplace. They didn't really understand putting them to produce something using the right.
Okay, so the first, to answer your first part of your question is, have I encountered a time where it didn't quite stick or didn't quite work? 100%. Now, there are several different reasons why. Sometimes they just don't know that's an expectation. So one of the first steps in the book is for leaders to reset the expectations. We can prevent 50% of all people-related dysfunction in our lives, not just workplaces, but in our lives, by driving clarity around expectations. My expectations of you and your expectations of me. So that is part of the challenge. But the other element, why
I've
people
never heard them
is
invoke.
to author is to be vulnerable.
That the
Author
recording
is to
is.
be vulnerable. So when you go to
So
that
I just
advisor,
want
the
to say that
author,
if it
something
happened,
that they can
and I assume if John Kelly
back
said,
in your mind, you
Yeah.
may be thinking,
I cannot
thinking,
witness to.
why is he even here? Like, why would he do that? And about 20% of direct reports I find struggle with the idea of stepping into the author seat because of that reason. Because in their minds, as long as I'm doing what my manager or leader tells me to do, I'm safe. I'm okay. I can't be held accountable as I'm just doing what that person told me to do. So it can be a little challenge for them to get over that hump.
You describe some of those challenges. One of them is over affirmation. You describe a manager trying to apply the principle and affirming everything that the subordinates brought to them. And that was one of the pitfalls that didn't necessarily work out because then we had conflict across different initiatives. So there wasn't coherence in the efforts. Can you talk about how some of the pitfalls of applying it when you're trying to be helpful as a manager?
So there are several. So one of the challenges around this, I actually I brought here as an example. So I've got my red pen here. And so why I love this as a nice prop is this is going to sound very obvious to everyone, but there's a big difference between an editor and a critic. And so what critics do is they just use this red pen. So if you've ever seen the movie Ratatouille, I'm sure you folks have seen the movie Ratatouille. Okay. So if you haven't seen the movie Ratatouille, the plot sounds ridiculous. There's this rat in Paris, and he is the best chef in Paris. And so they've got a food critic named Ego. And what he does is he goes around to all these restaurants and he just uses the red pen. He just shreds all these chefs. And in the end of the movie, there's this beautiful monologue where he talks about, being a critic is fun, but it's really all about you. You're just shredding everybody else's work. And so we want to be careful that we're not doing that. We don't want to just redline everything because that's going to discourage people from wanting to bring an idea. So we want to borrow from our friends in improv theater, and improv theater can say yes and. So yes, this is all good what you brought, and let's talk about this area over here. It's not quite right. So that's one of the important challenges or pitfalls. We want to make sure we're not overly critical. The other challenge and pitfall that you can reference there is we want to make sure we're also not giving people author and editor rights. So if we become too affirming, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, you just go do whatever you want to do. Well, that sounds good on paper, but that person may come back and say, hey, guess what? I just hired 7 people. Wait a minute, we don't have budget for 7 people. We don't have budget for you to hire 1 person. You can't go off and do that. So it's really an alignment conversation. It's meant to do a couple things. As the manager and leader, it's meant to enhance their critical thinking. That's really what we're trying to do. We're coaching up their critical thinking so they think about a problem just like we would. It's also meant to create alignment. So they bring us ideas and recommendations, we reach agreement, and then they move forward with that. If we affirm too much, what we're doing is we're allowing them to do the authoring and editing, and we may not be really helping to refine their thinking the way we need to.
Probably the most persuasive or compelling aspects I ran into with this was describing the offering up method in terms of a retail experience, where you go shopping and you can encounter a clerk who's an order taker, or you can encounter someone who really works hard to make you look great in certain clothes. And you call that a clientele perspective. Can you explain how that might look in the workplace using from your experience helping people employ this method?
So the concept came from one of my clients in the luxury retail space. And they said in luxury retail, with the emergence of e-commerce and everything else that was disruptive, they had to go from a clerking mindset to a clienteling mindset. And that's really what we're trying to embrace when we offer up. So when we clerk, we say, how can I help you? It's like going to the meeting empty-handed and saying, what would you like to talk about today, Adam? And you're the leader, right? We're clerking. Clienteling is a little different. Clienteling is when we say, you look great in this. We're being much more proactive. And so the whole idea is when we go to that meeting with a leader, we want to treat them like they're our number one customer, our number one client. And we want to say, you look great in this. So we want to share not only a status update, but our point of view, as well as recommendations. And that's clienteling. So we're treating that leader like a client or customer.
And to combine that with some of the improv analogy, that takes a risk.
It does.
You have to have some confidence in your judgment. I've thought about it before.
It does, but actually the biggest risk is will the leader be willing to switch the seats? Because some leaders prefer to author.
So
They prefer to just tell. So one of the challenges in this is the leader themselves. Maybe they prefer to just tell folks how to do things. They like that feeling of control. We often call those folks micromanagers. And so they like that. And so when you're trying to advise them or author them, they may not want to hear it. They just want to tell you what to do. Now, while that sounds reasonable, the challenge is if we author up and edit down, like I'm recommending in the book, you can have very efficient and effective 40-hour work weeks. Everybody, from the leader all the way down to everyone on the team. When the flow reverses and we author down or we micromanage, or we can't get our team to take any kind of ownership and we got to tell them what to do, that's when hours creep well past 60 hours. So it's really important and kind of incumbent on those leaders to trust and to loosen their grip and really allow that authoring up.
So there's vulnerability required on both sides.
Yes,
So, and from your background, you have a counseling background.
that's right.
So can you talk to us about how vulnerability in the workplace enables the optimized workforce? Because it's not always intuitive that thinking about vulnerability as a leader or as a subordinate is the key to success.
So this is going to sound so crazy to people listening to this, but vulnerability gives you tremendous speed in terms of how you operate and work. So a common term that's been kicked around a lot in the last 5 years, but even more commonplace today is psychological safety. This idea of creating a psychologically safe workplace, either my dynamic with a manager or a team member. When we feel psychologically safe in an environment, we drop all of our armor and weapons at the door. We feel safe enough to say to somebody, hey, here's bad news, and no, we're not going to get in trouble for being the messenger. Or offer a half-baked idea, or say, I don't know, or say, I was wrong, you were right, or even ask for help. And all those are forms of vulnerability. If we don't feel comfortable doing that, then we're going to hold that thing. And then a 2-alarm fire becomes a 5-alarm fire real fast. So when we feel comfortable in that space to be vulnerable, we share information a lot quicker. And frankly, as leaders, we can address problems a lot faster. And so in order to do that, the leader has to go first. They have to they have to be willing to be vulnerable to create that psychologically safe environment. So folks are willing to share ideas and recommendations.
So if you encountered authoring as a predicament in the workplace, and that's what gave rise to this, how easy is it for someone who has succeeded as an author and been promoted up the ranks because their authorship is so good to become an editor? Do you have any tips or insights as to how to get someone who's been praised and rewarded for authoring?
It's hard.
To turn and be a good
It's hard. It's tricky. So let's start with the traits of the author. Okay, so when we are sitting in that author seat, there's 3 big traits that we're exhibiting. We're taking ownership, we're showing initiative, and we're displaying critical thinking. We take ownership, we show initiative, we display critical thinking. The individuals that naturally do this, and there are many of them, we know these people, many of them are sitting here in this room today. They're the ones that get promoted. They're the ones that get tapped on succession plans. They're the ones that we say, there's a big future for this person, okay? So if we use another analogy, let's use a sports analogy. They win lots of MVPs. They win MVPs every year. They get tapped for promotions, and it's great. So now when we tell them to be an editor, what we're telling them really to do, using that analogy, is get off the field, grab a clipboard, and you're going to be a head coach. And your job is to create a world championship team. Well, you're telling someone who's won all these MVPs to get off the field and be a head coach. And the problem with being a head coach is the results come later. It's like a lag indicator. Well, think about a head coach. They don't, you know, it's about winning a championship. You don't know until the end of the season how you did. Whereas an MVP, you know, play by play. So it's a real big challenge to get folks to step off the field and then let other people run those plays that they did so well themselves. So yeah, it's really changing that mindset and making that shift.
Imagine that person also might feel underwhelmed, or they suddenly have more time. They're used to rolling up their sleeves and doing things, and now they're supposed to wait for things to be done so that they can critique.
It can feel like they should be out there working just as hard as their team. And they do need to be working just as hard as their team, but they should be working on different things. That's when we come back to that old adage, spend more time on the business rather than in the business. So those leaders, we want them to have that dedicated time to be thinking about, so where are we going? What are some changes we need to make? Stick their head above the tree lines and maybe plan for the next quarter versus just going fire to fire to fire. And most of this, just go fire to fire to fire.
Have you ever encountered working with somebody who took to the editor's seat too well and then stopped offering?
It does happen. It's not that common, but where we come into challenges with that is they're not doing the author role that they should as leaders. So as I mentioned earlier, 80% of the time I want leaders editing and then 20% of the time authoring. The only two things that leaders can author, that only they can author, the first one is strategy/priorities. So this would be goals for the year or quarter. So whether you're running a nonprofit, you're leading a church, you are running a business, be thinking about kind of what are the goals for the year or where are we trying to go? And then priorities is goals for that week. Because our teams live in a noisy world, they need focus. The second thing that only leaders can do is culture. Being able to talk about culture of the team and culture about the environment. So when I see leaders really kind of step away from their responsibilities, they may be delegating everything and sitting in the editor's seat, but they're not embracing the author role that they need to be. They're not talking about strategy or vision or priorities. They're not talking about culture. And frankly, today, I can tell you, most organizations, when they talk about culture today, all they're talking about is whether people should be working in the office or working at home. And they call that culture. That's where people work, folks. That's not culture. Culture is going back to old school, where what are those 5 values that we really stick to and how we treat each other, how we treat the people that we serve, how we view work quality. That's what culture is about. And it's aligns people around a common set of values. So you attract people that embrace those, and folks that want a different set of values go somewhere else. But since the pandemic, we don't talk about that anymore. We just talk about where folks work. So I would love to see leaders do more of that today.
Talk about where people work, then the consequence will be the culture, right? So the outcome of that will be the culture.
It will absolutely affect culture, but we're not thinking about that question through the lens of our values.
So I wonder if it's similar to what you talk about as the commander's intent coming from your exposure to the military. Can you talk about how the commander's intent, what that means and how that might be helpful to a manager trying to articulate this paradigm?
Yeah, so for folks that aren't familiar with the concept, commander's intent is the idea that the world is too VUCA. That's the acronym that they use in the military, and VUCA is VUCA, and it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The world's too volatile, too uncertain, too complex, too ambiguous. We can't give top-down directives and commands. There's too many moving parts. So instead, we step back and for a mission objective, and we say, here's commander's intent for that mission or objective. And commander's intent is the why, the what, and the when. But we stay away from the how. And why that is so important for author editor is when we do the why, the what, the when, and we allow folks to bring us the how, we're encouraging them to be creative on the solutions. We're encouraging and trying to develop a team full of chefs. Okay? However, if we dictate the why, the what, the when, and the how, so we're dictating all 4 of those, there's no ownership, there's no initiative, there's no critical thinking. We've just given them a recipe and said, cook that. And you'll end up with a team of cooks. which can be very difficult if you're needing a team of chefs in order for you to go from point A to point B.
So can you talk about a manager who has significant responsibilities and is leading a team and is trying to implement this program and this mindset in their team? That manager is ultimately responsible for the work that comes out of the team and is uncomfortable with that. Can you unpack maybe how we can think of responsibility in the workplace in a way that may be more helpful?
Absolutely. So this is a real challenge too, because there's a lot of organizations that really put a lot of expectations on leaders to know a lot of granular detail. And when they do that, then those leaders really are resistant to let other folks author. They want to author themselves. So that when they get put on the spot, they can answer those questions. But the downside is we're not developing the team below us. So it's a combination of being able to make sure that as a leader, you're still watching those targets, you're still keeping things moving, but you're also along the way trying to develop the critical thinking of your team so they can help you get there faster. Because the only way for us as leaders to go from in the business to on the business, the only way is we have to have a really high performing team under us that can put out all the fires. If we keep getting brought into fires, then there's no way we can elevate. So we need to keep doing that. That said, it doesn't always look the same. So sometimes when we author editor, it's obviously our meetings, folks come in with plans, we edit those plans. After multiple revisions, we approve them and they go do it. But there's other cases where we've got deadlines. There's no time for meetings. And sometimes we need to jump in as leaders and author it because that's just the way we need to do it. So I'll give you a great example. I was teaching this concept in one of our executive education courses, open enrollment, big plug for exec ed and open enrollment. And one of the individuals in there, several individuals, came from emergency room settings. They said, Brandon, how do you do this in an emergency room? It's because it's not like if a gunshot wound comes in and we say, let's have a meeting. What's your plan? Okay, you got to kind of deal with that. And so sometimes as leaders, we need to just jump in and deal with it, but don't miss the teaching moment, the coachable moment, the editing moment. So don't miss the opportunity to step back and say, hey, let me share with you why I made the call I did. So next time we get a gunshot wound, we're all on the same page on how to approach it. So sometimes it can be a revision back and forth. Other times we make the call as a leader because we got to move fast, but it's all about making sure we're intentional to continue to pour into and develop the thinking of our team. So we're elevating how they can solve problems.
You have a chapter where you apply this framework to the family. And so building people up is in the workplace is similar to building up children in the family. Can you talk about how?
Absolutely.
Like the same or
Okay.
different?
So I'm moving into dangerous territory here, people. Okay. Workplace is easy. Family, hard. Okay. And to be fair, we all have our own points of view around parenting. That's just part of, if you're a parent, you've got your own point of view. So I'm offering my point of view. Okay. So I will say this, the first author editor is a vertical tool. It works in any vertical relationship. So whether we're a leader and a manager and with a direct report, we're a parent with a child, we are serving a client, any vertical relationship. And so if the goal is we want to raise fully formed adults that make a positive contribution in the world, can pay their own bills, and do not live in our basement. If that is the goal, the parents to get there a little bit quicker shift from authoring everything and moving into that editor seat, typically in the tween or teen years. And so what that looks like is those tween or teenagers, they'll say, hey, why don't you learn how to do your own laundry? I'm not gonna do it for you. Why don't you make your own lunch going to school? Why don't you even choose what extracurriculars you're gonna continue doing? Even though you've been doing that one since you were 4, and you were so cute, and we thought that was the path to a college scholarship for you. And even get a part-time job. So startling statistic, Adam, I think startling, in the mid-1990s, 70% of all high school students in this country had a part-time job at some point in their high school career. Not throughout their high school career, but a part-time job at some point, 70%. The last time the study was done was 2018, so pre-pandemic. That statistic had dropped to 30%. 30%. So these are kids going all the way through high school, never working a job. Volunteering, don't confuse volunteering with working. Volunteering is not working. Volunteers have power. And so when we infuse volunteerism first instead of working, you have a 23-year-old that says, I'm sorry, I can't make the meeting, I have yoga. Because they're thinking like a volunteer, because volunteers can come and go as they please. Okay? So when you don't infuse that early on, you end up stunting certain maturity because the parents did too much for them. The parents weren't encouraging ownership, initiative, and critical thinking. So while this all sounds clean and easy, when we encourage ownership, initiative, and critical thinking to a bunch of 13-year-olds, are they going to make a lot of mistakes? Oh yeah, ruined laundry, missed assignments, lots of problems, right? And that's going to impact their grades, okay? And that may impact their ability to get into the school we want them to. And that's really hard to let go. So we have a tendency to want to author all that. We want to author their entire day, all their evenings, all their activities to create the perfect college application. And we may be successful with that. And those kiddos may go to those schools. And then guess what happens? They graduate and they are not ready for prime time. They need a few more years of seasoning in our basement. So it applies to that situation too. I would argue it's even harder and more painful when we bring it home, but the concept is all about two main points. We, as the leader, whether we're the parent or we're the manager, we're sitting in the right seats doing the things that only we can do. And two, we're constantly working to develop a team below us. So they can also grow, which allows us to do those things that only we can do.
Have you met some students that come out of their parents' basement when you teach in business schools? And have you applied this principle to them? Have you found that the students that are graduating from basements, they bring the same problem to the workforce?
So yes, so I'll say it this way. I don't see as much of that simply because in the role I play at the business school, I'm all dealing with graduate students. So it's typically kind of worked itself out. Usually by around 30, 31, 32, even if you start off in a different place, you'll catch up from a maturity standpoint. It's the early 20s where we see bumpiness. That's where we hear the stories of, 23-year-olds going on interviews, bringing their parents, or parents negotiating. It's around 15 to 17% of hiring managers are experiencing parents as part of the interview process.
Wow.
And that's what's happening. So it's also really important that we step back too. So from a therapy standpoint, whether we talk about it as a manager, but more importantly as a parent, when you do stuff, when you author for your team or author for your kids, the message you're signaling is you are not enough. You cannot do this without me. It's okay if you're going to do that as a manager. Don't do that as a parent, because that's where we see high spikes in anxiety. That's why we have such a challenge right now with anxiety in this country with kiddos and not only diagnoses, but medications, because they don't believe they're enough because they've got someone authoring everything for them, not encouraging. One of my favorite words as a therapist, which is essentially the author idea, is agency. They're not encouraging that sense of agency.
I've heard the CEO nowadays stands for Chief Everything Officer, because some of the people entering the workforce look to the CEO to solve so many personal, almost existential requirements. So I see the applicability of method for families, and then it's one that we can take to heart as these people come into our workforce. But a different question from the side. So you said vertical relationships, and we're talking about families. Where does this paradigm not work? And what sort of relationship?
So horizontal relationships, we have to modify. So let's say you and I were peers. Okay, so we're both directors in an organization. Okay, and I come to you and say, yeah, you authored this thing for me to edit. You'd say, who do you think you are, Brandon? No, I'm not gonna do that. We're both directors. So there's an implied power dynamic in author editor. Both seats are important, by the way. So while we talk about the editor having a lot of decision-making rights, which they do, the author sets the menu. And so there's a lot of power there. We're setting the menu. So if we are to do it horizontally with peers, The modification is both the parties have to sit in the same seat at the same time. So a better approach for me to say, hey, Adam, we got this problem I could use your help on. Let's schedule a meeting for us to offer some ideas together. And then we can schedule a second meeting to edit those and make a decision. So we're sitting in the same seat at the same time. We're using it as a collaborative tool rather than with an applied power dynamic.
Would you recommend that principle to apply between spouses as well?
Wait, hold on. Okay.
So my wife is sitting in the second row and she said no. The answer is no.
Probably a good answer.
I do think it's healthy and helpful to always start that place. Now with spouses, spouses have different family, different spouses have different roles and responsibilities. So one person may have more of an ownership over a certain category than another, so we want to respect that. But it's a good general spirit, sure.
Okay.
She seemed happy with that answer. I think I did okay. She kind of went, okay, that's okay.
So it seems your background in counseling allows you to see people in the family, in the workplace, a bit different than some other business professionals may see them. Can you talk about how you took your practice from counseling and what you learned about people in counseling and started applying it to the workforce?
That's a book all by itself, Adam. I would say, well, we'll step back from it. People are people. We bring our baggage with us. So we start off with a family system that we grow up in that has parents or parental figures. We may have siblings, and then that's essentially how we learn to operate. And then we go to a workplace, and what do you have? You have peers, which are like proxies for siblings, that we may be competing for resources. And then we have parents, which are our managers or leaders, which we're trying to impress or get them to get their approval. So we do borrow a lot of that we bring in, and that's why you see people react in the same situation so differently. They can have very different reactions. So I was actually, in fact, I was talking to a client this week, and this client was very frustrated because this particular person on their team was getting upset because they felt like the other peers on the team were being critical of them and they weren't getting enough attention. Well, that wasn't the case at all, but that was their lens they looked through. So there's definitely that part of the challenge. But then, of course, as a therapist, the number one training that I got that is the most valuable and helpful for me in the workplace is my ability to listen and answer questions and just really be able to discern what's going on. Because even if I'm trying to coach someone, I would never come out of the gate with a piece of advice in the first 5 minutes of the conversation. I really want to learn and understand where they're at. So when I do provide advice, not only is it more accurate, they're probably ready to hear it.
What's the final question? What's the one takeaway that you hope that readers of this book will put on?
The biggest takeaway is self-awareness. That's the number one. It's just being able to notice. That's the first step to any change. Notice. What seat am I sitting in? If you find yourself feeling heavy all the time and doing all the work, well, that's the trait of an author. You're probably in the author seat all the time, whether you're a parent or whether you're a leader. If you feel like it's all on your shoulders and you're saying to yourself, why can't these people step up? Well, it's probably because you're heroing too much. The hero trap is one of the big traps. And you're carrying too much. So it's that self-awareness to understand, maybe I'm taking on things that I shouldn't. Maybe I need to put those in the proper places. And then how can I support those folks when I do give them the necessary responsibilities?
Great. We're going to turn to the audience for any questions that y'all may have. We have a microphone roaming around. If you have a question, please, when you receive the microphone, just stand up and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Becky Marks from Princeton, New Jersey. My question is, you talked a lot about culture and you talked about being an author. What happens if you are not I'm the manager level, not the VP level, and I think this is amazing, but I bring my authorship to somebody who should be the editor and get very defensive and really doesn't want to embrace this paradigm? How would you recommend helping them along?
That's a great question. So we want to we're trying to author up with this person that's wanting to essentially micromanage them. They want to keep their hand on the steering wheel a little too tight. So my counsel is sell it to them with their greatest pain point. Everyone's greatest pain point, listening to this in this room, is time. That's our greatest pain point, time. So simply say to them, you know, I really want to honor your time. I want to try something in our next meeting if you're open to that. Can I bring you some ideas that and recommendations that I'm seeing for us to have some conversation around that? Can I author some things for us for you to edit? Would you be open to that? Any rational human being is going to say yes to that.
That's a whole other.
If they,
Whether they're rational
if-
or not.
you call that. If they say no, now
Then
you can
it's not
direct
your
them to
fault.
me as a therapist, or we might need to find another home. But a high percentage of individuals will say, of course. And then the burden is on us, make that really efficient, make that a really great meeting. So I was coaching a client a few years ago. He worked in a consulting firm. He wasn't one of the managing directors, but he was real close. He was a level down. And he was really complaining about his leader, micromanaging everything. And I said, well, you're great at managing clients. That's what you do. You're a consultant. Why don't you treat him as your number one client? And he did that. He went into the meeting and he said, treat him like a client, did everything that we're talking about here. He said, when he finished the meeting, his leader said, this was the best meeting I've had in a real long time. I actually felt like a client today. So try it and see how they do it, but sell it to them and sell it that you're trying to honor their time, because that's really what we are trying to do. Give them something to react to. Great question. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Brandy, you mentioned in some environments where an employee may not feel comfortable offering, right? Might be an environment that doesn't encourage difference, or they have some other anxiety about that. What would you say as tips or counsel to those employees to help them kind of get over that and take this to the next level from a communication perspective for that employee?
Yeah, so let's say we got somebody really struggling. I mean, this is very uncomfortable for them. They don't like the vulnerability of offering. So the American Psychological Association's got some great tips on helping develop resilience, and they work really well in that case. So one of them is kind of a reframing the situation as not an insurmountable problem. So say to them, hey, I believe in you. I know you can do this. That's one. Second is remind them that they're growing through this. Like this whole process is going to help you grow and learn. So help them do that. Third, remind them too that they're not going to die. Like they're not going to get fired if they bring a bad idea. It's just an opportunity for rich discussion. And the last point is they say provide hope. And reminds me that we had a famous theologian at Candler actually named Jim Fowler, and he since passed away. But Jim Fowler used to say, as leaders, we're going to provide two things: provide folks hope and handles. Hope is here's where I'm trying to take you or us, and handles here's what I need you to do this week to get there. So any of those can be great ways to just reframe it for them, that this is more about their growth and nothing bad is going to happen if they do it. Make it feel a little safer. That's some.
All right, we actually have a question from one of our Zoom callers, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask it on their behalf, from Zahira Tiber. The question is, in the context of research or highly technical fields like science, where expertise is often centralized, how can leaders effectively delegate author tasks without compromising quality?
Great question. Great question. And I actually think it creates better ideas and better alignment. So I had a mentor of mine share with me years ago. He said, we all hold a piece of the truth. And I love that idea. So when we are giving people author rights, we're trying to pull out more pieces of the truth. So we're not, as a reminder, we're not giving them, when they have author rights, they don't have decision-making rights. They're just going to bring us things for us to react to. So what I like about this, particularly in technical fields, is we're really helping to elevate and align that critical thinking, and we're also reaching agreement. So I think it can be very, very valuable in those settings. Now, it can be hard for folks to feel like they have to have all the answers. So I was facilitating a conversation around this not too long ago with some of our friends that work in the Federal Reserve Bank. And this was all a group of economists. And they really struggled with this because they felt like they individually were supposed to have all the answers. And this is a group of economists for the 6th district. Well, that's ridiculous. Obviously, the economy is a very complicated, messy thing, and the answer can never lie in one person's head. But sometimes we get into scientific, technical areas, we think we're supposed to have all the answers. And if we've gone through PhD programs, we might have been taught that we're supposed to have all the answers. And if we don't have an answer, we get beaten up on that. So I love this as a great way to create alignment and agreement on the path forward to drive clarity, because it really is an alignment. So, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for the question.
Jonathan Stelling, Brandon, you touched on this a little bit already. We talked about culture and then even parenting. There are 4 generations in the workplace now. Can you talk a little bit about the interplay of some of the differences in the generations and how this concept applies?
Yeah, boy, this is a whole other next question. Then that question. It's a really, really great question, challenging question with our 4 generations. Just to call up the elephant in the room, I mean, the biggest difference is work style and communication style. So that's really what we're talking about. And so, you know, if you think about different generations, so if we're more the boomer generation, we're going to use the phone as one of our go-to resources. That's one of our go-to things. Call somebody. Right? If we're Gen X, we're going to use email. That's going to be our way of communicating. If you're going to be in the millennial generation, you're going to use a hybrid of usually email, but it's also going to be a lot of instant messaging and other tools like Slack. And then if you're Gen Z and then Alpha, it's going to be whatever the app or tool of the day is. You're going to use, and a lot of shorthand, a lot of shorthand. So all those things are perfectly fine. It's incumbent upon the manager and leader to drive some level of consistent expectation. And that's why one of the best things in author editor is to set the expectation. When you come to the meeting, this is what I want you to be able to talk about. Status update, what do you see? Your point of view on what you think is going on, and recommendations. And if you need to, you can always provide a template. So everyone's got a consistent way of communicating. So I would say, you know, the challenge is multiple different ways of communicating that we've all grown up with. And then for us as managers, the solve is create a template of what we expect, right? That clarity around expectation that will prevent some of the dysfunction.
Got a question right over here.
The author editor, it's really interesting. The author is a visionary. The editor is the fact fixer or fact finder. But each has to get, the editor also has to get the vision of the author. And all this lead up to someone you probably know of as Carl Rogers, who was very egoless. Was he an author? Was he an editor? I would like your take on that. He seemed to be very egoless and neither one of those. But he did author visionary statements. He was very successful both in terms of counseling and in terms of international negotiation when he applied himself to that. How would you look at that paradigm?
So the comment was about Carl Rogers and kind of Rogerian therapy. And so great, I'm a big fan of Carl Rogers and that kind of person-centric therapy. And I think he did both. I think he did both well. I think there was a time and place to author when he puts out his point of view. In fact, his point of view, what makes a really good counselor and therapist, I think you could replace that with leader because he does a really good job of that. Like having unconditional positive regard, accurate empathy, some of those elements. I think he's really good at that and he authors that. However, to be a really good therapist and counselor, that's all about editor. So if we think about if we take that analogy of editor, like when I've done my books, my editor never came to me and said, "Hey, Brandon, I hate chapters 4 and 5. I'm rewriting them." No, they gave me feedback on how I need to rewrite that because their goal is to make me a New York Times bestseller. They want me to live my best life. And as a therapist, that's the goal. We're trying to help other people live their best life. And just for a side note for folks who are curious, the difference between a therapist / counselor and a coach, coaches can give advice. Therapists are not supposed to, because that can create a codependent relationship. So it's all about asking questions so that the client can come to their own decisions and ideas. So I would say, long-winded answer to say, I think he sits in both seats pretty well, or sat in those seats pretty well. Wayne has been having his hand up
Thank you.
for quite some time.
You're very kind. Thank you. I just wonder if you, Wayne Kerr, sorry, dental school, for those of you who don't remember that we were the #3 dental school in the nation. What a privilege to be here. Have you found that there was a loss of self-esteem for those teens who have been raised in a family where decisions have largely been made for them?
Absolutely, Wayne. So if we have, so you said teens where decisions have been made for them? Was that the question? Teens that have been, was this? Loss of self-esteem, I'm actually more okay with loss of self-esteem than loss of agency. Because loss of agency is a whole lot worse. Self-esteem is, I don't feel good about myself, but I will still work on it. Agency is, I'm not enough. I can't do life. I can't go on that interview. I can't have this conversation. It'd be too awkward. I can't do it. I can't. I must have mom and dad with me. So it's really crippling human beings and making them codependent. And it's very, very problematic. So I would, it's funny to say this, I'd rather see the loss of self-esteem than the loss of agency.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lila Luopa, and I'm curious in your thoughts, if you have someone that you're coaching and they're a leader and they're trying to hand over authorship, but their direct report doesn't seem that they can really grasp that, and you've tried every which way to do that, where do we go from here? That is what I'm curious.
Okay, so the question is, I'm trying to get this direct report to step up and they won't.
Yeah.
So the starting place is asking them the question, so where do you want to go? And if they say, I'm perfectly fine in the role that I'm at, it might mean that, so in the HR world, we call those folks solid citizens. They come in, they do their work, they leave. They do great work, but they have no aspirations of going anywhere further. You don't have no aspirations to have them go anywhere further, and they can sit in that same role for 10 or 15 years. And that's okay, they're great. They're great at what they do. Maybe it's okay, they just want to be told what to do. And they're more in an individual contributor role, that's fine. By the way, you don't have to author in individual contributor roles. You don't have to author even in some major roles. Once you hit director level and above, it's not an option. You can't author and you're director and above, you've been over promoted. Or folks have been over promoted. So that's a slight distinction. So you ask them where they want to go, anchor it to that. This will help you get there. Try and make the first step as simple as possible, provide them a template. Okay, if they're still struggling with that, do peer coaching, pair them up with another member of the team that's really good at this. Say, hey, I want you to spend time with Sandra. She's really good at how she thinks about preparing for these meetings. She can give you some ways of thinking about it. So just make it as simple as possible. The starting place for this is, as long as direct reports are bringing you something to react to, the seats are set properly. But if they bring nothing, then by definition, we're in the author seat. We're telling them what to do. Now, the last thing I'd add around this is, there's some subtle traps around this where folks will try and switch the seats back. You'll tell them to bring something, they'll come empty-handed, they'll say, I just didn't know what you wanted. I didn't want to disappoint you. Or I was really confused. Or a number of other phrases to get you to kind of switch the seats. So if they do that, you want to say, I've got some thoughts before I share them, go back and put your best thinking down on paper. If they continue to come empty-handed, cancel the meeting. When they show up, cancel the meeting. I can see you're not prepared. I don't want to waste your time or mine. When can you be prepared to bring something, and let's reschedule? And of course, you could get them a copy of the book. You see when I did that? That was the last. Another option. It's available on Audible too, so they can listen to it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm gonna come out from behind computer here. All right. I think everyone, do we have any other questions in the room? Oh, let's turn it over to Pam real quick.
It's less of a question and more of a, will you share a story? So, you've talked a lot about the importance of vulnerability and building trust. And I've had the privilege of getting to hear a lot of your stories, but there's one story that you share about a leader who really hadn't been very vulnerable with his team, and therefore there wasn't so much trust. Can you talk about that particular story, if I'm ringing enough bells for you to tell that story without me telling you for it? Because I think it was really key in setting up a team environment, because it's hard. I mean, back to, I don't know what your concern was, but sometimes there's lack of trust. A direct report might feel overly judged, or that they're just too vulnerable and there's not enough trust there. And so how can trust come in and be built so that teams can actually thrive?
So I'm thinking of a lot of different stories. Do you have any more particular detail, or would you like me to just riff off of that?
You can go, you've got a lot of stories, so just riff off of that.
Okay. So when we are vulnerable, what we're doing is, many of you have probably heard of Brene Brown. She's kind of the expert in this space. And she talks a lot about the power of vulnerability. Vulnerability feels like weakness. It feels like we're going to be exposed or we're being taken advantage of. But what we're really doing is, when you're vulnerable in the right ways and right amounts, what we're doing is we're inviting people in. We're saying, I don't know, but I'm sure we can figure it out together. It's kind of leader as facilitator, rather than feeling like they have to have all the answers. When we are not vulnerable as leaders, we're sending the message to our teams, you can't be vulnerable either. And then what do people do? They hold that 2-alarm fire till it becomes a 5-alarm fire. So I'll give you a great example of a leader I was working with on a senior team recently. This particular leader, she was really in the department she was working in, there was some real problems. And one of the challenges with senior teams is, everyone wants to look good. You're all senior team. However, you're all really smart people, and the senior team's supposed to help each other. So you want to come in and bring something for folks to help you with. Borrowing our friends from improv theater, they have a saying they do every time they're about to do a show. They say, bring a brick, not a cathedral. When we bring a cathedral, there's nothing, well, that's nice. That's a nice cathedral you built there. But you bring a brick, now I can bring a brick. And this particular leader was really uncomfortable bringing the brick. She was uncomfortable telling the team, we're really struggling in our function and department, and I could use your best thinking. And because of that, she kept hiding problems. Well, the problems got so big, they ended up deciding she wasn't the right leader for the job. And just to kind of expand a little bit further, if we think back to the pandemic, the leaders that navigated through that the best were the ones that said, I don't know what's going on here. None of us really know what's going on here, but we're going to do our best thinking and solve for this together. Versus the leaders that said, I know what's going on, which no one really believed to be true. We're still doing a lot of retrospectives on what's happened there and what we need to do going forward. So embracing that uncertainty and trying to bring out the best thinking makes it more of an invitation. And again, it's speed of information and trust, which again gets into a trust formula that we don't necessarily have time for today. Thank you, Pam.
All right, well, thank you so much. Please join me in giving a round of applause for I'm Nicole Walker. I'm the managing director of alumni engagement here in the Emory Alumni Association, and wanted to thank you all for being a part of what I think might be the first official homecoming event. Congratulations, thanks for taking it off of that. Lots of special people in the room today, one of which just left the room, Emory Hall. She organized this fantastic event. She's officially been at Emory for 6 months, and she did a fantastic job organizing tonight's event. Definitely keep an eye out for additional learning and development programs. We're hoping to do a couple more book club conversations as well for the learning and development lens. We also have several other book clubs within the Emory Alumni Association, like the Alumni and Women of Emory Book Club. Lori Flacker here is one of the chairs of that.
All my women.
Yes. But we are very excited to give out 2 door prizes for tonight, one for a virtual guest and one for an in-person. So for our in-person guest, David Rybach, You hear something? Yeah, great. David. And then for our virtual guest, Kelly Stewart, we will connect with you afterwards, to get you your prize tags. Oh, thank you. We look forward to seeing you throughout the weekend, and if not, we hope to see you at another, a learning and development event in the very near future.
Great job.
Yes, and for those in the room, Brandon will be selling some books back here on this side of the room. So please, of course, feel free to, and signing them. So feel free to hang out for a bit. There's plenty food and drinks as well. Thank you for your patience to everyone. With the fun traffic being, think out your thing.
You need to check that out.